Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. First, as always, at the beginning, we always want to thank Andrew, Aseptic Fruit Purees, Craft Brewery Financial Training, otherwise known as Carrie Shumway, Jason Sleeman, Brewery Lender, for sponsoring this free and creating this spring virtual conference. I think the conferences are infinitely valuable and really appreciate the opportunity to be here, as well as all the effort that Andrew goes to put them together. So this morning, afternoon, depending on where you are, we're going to talk about how do I know I'm making good beer? And our presentation today is a meeting of terrific people across the craft beer industry who have spent decades working to help breweries understand and identify quality challenges and solutions in their beer and brewing processes. And that's simply what Start a Brewery is about, is raising the bar for quality establishments and businesses within the industry through education. And we're also lowering the bar for those without direction, mentors, and resources to make it possible for them to live their dreams through our free website, podcast, and other stuff that we're putting out there as well. So today we're going to dive in on the QA/QC side of things. And so I'd like everybody to introduce themselves, maybe tell a little bit about your QA/QC background, and then most importantly for today, how you personally define good beer. So Lindsay, you're next to me on the Brady Bunch Square.
Hey, it's nice to see everyone here, and thanks for being here. My name is Lindsay Barr. I am a founding partner and CSO of DraughtLab. Before I was DraughtLabbing, I was at New Belgium Brewing Company. I spent about 10 years there as the sensory and consumer research specialist. And then before that, spent some time at UC Davis studying all things beer and all things sensory. So my background is primarily in sensory and specifically in brewing. A little bit about quality. So what is quality to me? Quality to me is actually just defined by the customer. When it comes down to it, is somebody going to be buying your beer? Is it going to be purchased consistently? And really that can only be defined by the purchaser. So the challenge that we have in quality control is trying to translate what the customer wants using their language into what can be measured in the brewery. And so if we can nail that, we have an amazing business. So it really has to be both subjective and objective measurements that we take into account when defining what quality is.
Awesome. John, you're next on my square.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, my name is John Hughes. I am the director of the professional brewing programs at UC Davis Continuing and Professional Education. So we have a Master Brewer Certificate program, both in person and online. We've got a number of short courses as well, also in person and online. And so I came here via working as a quality manager at a brewery. I was at Heretic Brewing Company for a number of years, where I set up their QA/QC lab and served as QA manager as well as packaging manager for a period of time. My background's in microbiology, so I'm all about the yeast and their metabolism and how that leads to flavors in beer. But I would say my definition of good beer personally is, would I have a full pint of it and maybe a second full pint? But really, I think consistency is the name of the game. And so being able to produce the exact same product day in and day out, and being able to recognize any of the changes or potential defects that can be part of that. That's how I define quality.
Sorry,
I'm below you.
Go ahead.
So I'm below you, so I can take over if you want. Yeah, my name is Erik Fowler. I'm the head of education at Witte Labs. This year will be 9 years for me at Witte Labs. I was with a regional brewery prior, and then a small nano brewery as well. So I've been able to see all levels of production and all the difficulties that go along with that, especially over the last decade plus. But quality, I think, is a fun topic because it's going to be a different answer depending on who you ask, right? Quality to a consumer is going to be, their needs are going to be a lot different than than quality to a specific position within a brewery. So I think quality to me is defined as a consensus between the maker, the producer, and the consumer as well. And maintaining quality, I think, is probably almost more important. Standardizing what quality is and maintaining it is if not more of an important conversation, I think, than breaking it down to be specific aspects of a brand.
Fair. Mel, you're next on my square.
Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Timm. Really glad to be here. This is my first re-entry into anything professional since having my little one. He's 4 months old. So pardon any brevity with any baby brain. That's still very much so happening. I worked for Avery Brewing Company for about 5 years, and I saw through some really rapid growth there. I was working in the quality department, started in the lab, and eventually wound up developing a sensory program for the brewery. I went on to work for a company called Cara Technology. They create the Aroxa flavor standards that are commonly used in sensory training. So I really took a deep dive into beer sensory training. From there, I also took on a position with the Brewers Association as quality trainer. We traveled around the country as a small team and taught brewers how to develop smaller labs and work through a few really approachable methods to improve the quality of their beer. That was called the Basics of Beer Quality workshop. I would love to echo everything that Lindsay, John, and Erik have said regarding how they see and how they view beer quality. I think it all rings really true to me as well. I would add that I think that quality beer is intentional beer. It's the beer that the brewer intended to make, which is beer that is made free of defects, that is made to be true to the style that they're hoping to achieve, that it's consistent, that it's shelf stable, and that it's not the result of a happy accident, but it's a beer that was made with intention. And obviously a beer that I would, on a personal level, if I'm going to put down a whole pint or 2 pints of it, it's something that speaks to me as well.
Awesome. Neil, want to clean up on this one?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Neil Witte. I'm with Craft Quality Solutions. It's a consulting business of mine that I run out of Kansas City. I also do draft services. I'm also the Associate Director of Exams at the Cicerone Certification Program. I've held both those roles for about 6 years now. Previous to that, I was with Boulevard Brewing Company in Kansas City for 19 years. 16 of those was as the field quality manager, working out in the marketplace with distributors and retailers and our sales team, making sure that all the things that could happen out in the marketplace weren't happening to the beer. Previous to that, I was a brewer at Boulevard, and then for a brewer at a brew pub company before that. So, as far as my definition of quality, I mean, we've had, we've kind of covered the spectrum here. I think there's, everybody has touched on a lot of those elements. Myself, I would say there's like a baseline of objective things that make up quality beer, especially, in the brewery when it comes to certain off flavors that might be produced that are pretty much universally not desired, and some things that you can do or not do at the brewery that's going to make a difference with those kind of objective things. Beyond that, there's a whole host of subjective things as to what people like. And then, once you get outside the brewery, I think you're almost always talking about objectively, are we maintaining what the brewer intended? Are we serving what the brewer intended to serve? And if you're not, then, more likely than not, that's going to be an issue. It's in a nutshell, that's kind of how I'd characterize quality for beer.
Sounds great. So when we met, for all of you out there that are watching this now or later, we needed to kind of find, as Erik put it, an anchor. We needed to have a place from which to discuss today. And we decided that the flight is a good place to start. So Whether you have a brand new customer coming into your tap room, your brew pub, your restaurant, or whether that's somebody that's coming in on a regular basis, a flight is very often the way that your customer gets to know you and gets to understand who you are and what you represent as brewers, as a brewing community. There's a whole lot of experiential stuff that goes into that initial expression of who you are. And when it's coming through your beer, you want to make sure that's the best expression possible. And so we anchored our discussion today in that flight. And so we'll talk about what if the customer sees, what if the customer smells, what if the customer experiences, tastes, to kind of set that stage to make this relevant to anyone and everyone who is taking the time to watch us today. So Lindsay, if you'll bridge us kind of into the flavor zone, we'll get it started.
The bridge into the flavor zone. That's where I live my life. That's beautiful. Yeah. So when we were talking about this, we were talking about, what is quality, and what it ultimately came down to was it had a lot to do with the flavor, because flavor is what the customer experiences. They couldn't care less about the analytical parameters, although they do help in trying to achieve that flavor, especially consistently. So if you think about like all the analytical parameters or micro parameters that you're looking at within the quality control department, all of them point to some sort of flavor objective. So that's where we ended up just kind of anchoring our conversation. So you sit down for a flight, and as a brewer, you're really interested in what do they like? What are they experiencing? Is it consistent with what their ideas of what this product needs to be? And that can be really different depending on your business objectives. It can be really dependent on your location, just who are your customers. So it comes down to not just is the flavor of the beer free of defects, but it's also, is it like what Mel said, is it also what the brewer intended? So, we didn't want to focus solely on off flavors in this discussion, but we wanted to also think about, how do I actually achieve oranginess, or how do I actually achieve low bitterness or low astringency, and that sort of thing. So what we did when we were talking about this on our Zoom call, I just was inspired. And so I looked a little bit into what some of the common things that we've seen within the DraughtLab space about what flavors do we see pop up every once in a while. And what are some of those flavors that can actually point to potential quality slippings? So we'll just call it that. So we wanted to point out a couple of different quality or flavors that could indicate something going on, maybe on the hot side, the cold side, packaging, and in serving, so that we can ground this conversation. So first of all, I wonder if anybody can guess. Let's use the chat. I wonder if anybody can guess, sitting on here, what the most common flavor we see within the DraughtLab database. What's the most common? We'll say aroma. What's the most common aroma? Let's see what guesses we get, and then I'll tell you at the end. So stay tuned. So again, to ground the conversation, we wanted to talk about what are some of the flavors that could impact your consumers' desire and willingness to continue to drink the product, and then we'll kick it over to what might be going on the hot, cold, packaging, and serving side. So we're going to start with 4 flavors to kind of ground us on what can maybe happen on the hot side that might be a quality slipping. One of the most common flavors that we see is astringent, so astringency. Astringency in kind of like more accessible terms is like dryness, mouth drying. So when you take a sip of something and you suck on your tongue and it feels kind of sandpapery, that's astringency. Typically, astringency has a negative influence on consumer liking. And you can see this. We can see this information with sensory. We can see what do people like and what are some of the flavors that influence liking or disliking, as it were. With astringency, typically is a disliking thing. So that's one of the common flavors that we see. Or common mouthfeels that we see. A couple more: graininess, DMS, and haze/particulate. Those are the 4 that I want to start with: astringency, DMS, grainy, and haze. And these all have some indication of hot side issues. So who wants to take the hot side issues that might be caused with those 4, might result in those 4 different flavors?
Erik, Neil?
Well, I'd say, right off the bat, astringency, the first thing I think of is extraction of tannins from husks. And, a couple things that pop into my mind right away are hot sparge, getting too hot, and extracting tannins when you're, when you're not really wanting to extract them. That's going to impart some astringency. Too fine of a grind in the mill can contribute to that as well. Those are some things that pop into my mind right away. What about you, Erik?
Yeah, so some of my personal experiences, astringency tends to be more closely tied to probably the most popular beer style of the last couple of years, hazy IPAs. And what I've seen is, there's pros and cons to this, is actually a lot of breweries will release beers a little bit on the green side, knowing that they're going to hit the market after a week or two when people are actually going to be able to consume them. And I've seen a lot of these beers tend to still have a lot of vegetal matter and some of those acids still in suspension, whereas maybe through conditioning they might fall out and kind of balance the beer a little bit more. So I tend to see a lot of it derived from like poor hopping techniques, oxidized hops, or releasing a beer such as a hazy IPA a little on the green side. And occasionally those will kind of condition out, but I have seen that astringency kind of persist throughout the shelf life of those products as well. White Labs Brewing Co. has had that problem very intermittently, so we've had to kind of look at what the changes in the recipes are, and occasionally a specific yeast strain might lend that astringency a little bit more than another, depending on how they can pull some of those acids out of solution.
Nice. So that takes care of astringency. Who wants to take like DMS? What is DMS, and where could it potentially come from, and how can you mitigate it?
Well, DMS is one of those kind of naturally occurring things. There's a precursor that comes pretty much ready-made in malt. And that precursor, when heat is applied, turns into DMS, and it makes the wort and then later the beer, if you don't get rid of it, smell like vegetal or cooked corn. So that application of heat turns into DMS, but on the brew house, if you get a good rolling boil, you should volatilize most of that. And there are some malts, particularly very pale malts like Pilsner malt, which are very high in that precursor. And it's hard to get rid of all of that DMS. So oftentimes pale lagers will exhibit low levels of DMS even after, getting a really good rolling boil. One of the other ways that you could potentially end up with a little bit more DMS in your beer is standing too long in the whirlpool. If for whatever reason you don't have a fermenter ready, you have hot wort that's not boiling anymore, sitting in the whirlpool waiting for a fermenter, or just sitting there for whatever reason a little bit too long, you can be converting more of that precursor into DMS, and then that transfers right through to your beer.
I think almost a more interesting look at this topic is not all of these compounds or characteristics are undesirable all the time, right? There are some national brands that are known for having DMS, and the weight of those are also different. DMS is not something I've seen in the market very readily compared to astringency, right? Like astringency is something I encounter quite a bit, and it's very negative and off-putting for me, and I would argue probably for most consumers. But DMS is something that may be desirable, as you're mentioning, for certain styles and certain contexts for specific brands. So I think that's important to note, that not all of them are considered off flavors or attributes, and just depending on what the goal is and how you're defining quality.
Yep, absolutely. A fruit beer with no diacetyl isn't a fruit beer. And so we like think about that too. Like, these are all bad, these are all good, and that's just not the case. It really comes down to what is expected for that product, and what's driving liking in that flavor. Did anybody want to take some of the other two that I mentioned, graininess or haze, particulate issues that could come out of the hot side?
I can take on the haze. So, yeah, I mean, Erik was talking about the New England style or hazy IPA being the kind of dominant style right now, but I think that the West Coast IPA is starting to make a comeback, which I'm very pleased about. I like the nice, clear, bright IPAs, and sometimes you see in those a haze that what we call chill haze, and so this is something that kind of appears when the beer is chilled down, and then it'll kind of disappear once it warms up again. And there are two really solid ways of kind of getting rid of this. One is rapid chilling, post-boil, post-whirlpool. The other one is actually carrageenan. So carrageenan is a polysaccharide derived from seaweed. In the homebrewing world, Whirlfloc is a really common product that is carrageenan. You can get more purified versions of it. Specifically, the kappa carrageenan is what is very active against these proteins that will cause this chill haze. And so, adding that in the boil can definitely help prevent that chill haze from forming.
Yep, nice. A lot of us are trying to get haze, and that's just like so opposite of what we learned. But yeah, those bright beers. Did anybody want to take grainy, or do we want to just leave that one?
I could talk a little bit about grainy, and then I'll transition into how we can start to measure or predict some of these flavors arising in beer. Grainy, it comes down to improper overmilling of grain or potentially boiling of the husk. And if anybody has anything to add to that, I'm not a professional brewer. I focus more on quality, but it generally tastes and presents like grape nuts, or like a branny kind of a cereal. And once again, I think, to echo what Erik said, at a low level in some styles, a touch of graininess might actually like round out a beer. So it's a defect when it doesn't belong, but it doesn't always. It's oftentimes, has a place at a very low level. How can we measure for these things? I think that especially on the hot side, as we know, it's a living process, and it's something that happens quickly. You can't just shut down the brewing process when you potentially pick up on something, or you pick up on a flavor after the fact. It doesn't present itself immediately. So I think that the first and the most powerful thing that any brewer can and should do is keep really meticulous brew logs, and I think that's a really important piece of quality assurance. There are so many variables that you could introduce into your process, and so many changes, adjusting your sparge temperature to monitor astringency, adjusting your malt grind to make sure that you're monitoring or keeping against astringency and graininess, experimenting with different yeast strains for your New England IPA, and understanding the timing on everything, writing down everything, times, temperatures, pHs at every step of the process in a controlled manner, I think will allow you to understand that when you make one little change, you can go back and see if it's traced back to a flavor result, see if it's traced back to that change that you made. So that's number one. What tools do you need in order to take these measurements and keep these brew logs? A digital gravity meter, a digital densitometer, I think is the new way. They're so approachable now and so affordable. And there's less room for error than there is using a hydrometer. So I would highly suggest Antone Barr makes a few different types of digital density meters. Get a great pH meter. Measuring pH properly, actually, there is a science behind it, and the ASBC and Brewers Association have created. They've collaborated and created a series of videos for educational purposes that are free and accessible on YouTube. And there is one specifically on measuring pH properly. So I suggest checking that out as well. Getting a high quality temperature probe also. A malt sieve. A malt sieve costs $200, and that is such an easy way to measure and record your grind, and link that to anything that might be happening downstream. Furthermore, if there are bigger questions at hand that you might not have the capacity to measure within your brewery, there are some third-party labs and I'm going to come back and echo a lot of these statements because they relate to every step of the process. But out here in Colorado, we have Colorado State University's malt testing lab. So they're a third-party lab and a university, an accredited university with a great brewing program, and they're really diving deeply into malt quality. So brewers can send their samples in and their wort samples in for some higher level testing. And then there's also some sensory methods that I'll let maybe Lindsay touch on a little bit later that can kind of help support this area of the brewing process as well.
Yeah, certainly. So considering hot side sensory methods, if anybody's tasted wort, they know it tastes warty. At New Belgium, we tasted wort a little bit. And after a certain period of time, I'm like, we're learning nothing about this, so take it out. And that's one of the things that is a really liberating thing to do in sensory, like not always just adding tasting points because we can add tasting points, but really understanding why are we tasting at these certain points? Are we ever making decisions tasting here? And if the answer is no, we're never making decisions off of this, then stop tasting there. If even if the wort tasted a little less warty, what would the decision be? The decision would be, well, ferment it and let's see. So if the decision is always going to be ferment it and let's see, then taste after you've fermented. So I don't suggest tasting wort unless you want a sweet treat when you're, before you've added hops. But I'm not a big wort fan. Too high gravity doesn't really ever lead to a decision that's meaningful. So I don't like tasting wort. I do, however, like tasting malt. It's delicious. And B, it can really indicate maybe some stuff that's going on with your producers, or it can help inform what vendor to purchase from before making complete beers out of it. The hot steep method is amazing. I'm a really big fan of the hot steep method. It ends up resulting in a 5 Plato wort, and we have validated it and use it for the craft malt cup and those types of things as well. So it's a repeatable, reproducible sampling plan. However, as a brewer, tasting every single batch of malt might be a non-starter. So I would only use it when you are trying to make a specific decision, maybe to inform early product development, or to evaluate, investigate an anomaly, or to maybe evaluate a new crop year. Those kinds of pivot points are an appropriate time to taste your malt using the hot steep method. The chew method tells you very little. It might just tell you, is there something horribly wrong? But the hot steep method will help you kind of pick apart some nuances. I'll leave the hop stuff for later, and we can just move on to the cold side. So moving on to the cold side, we're following a day in the life of your beer. We've moved it through the hot side, and now it's going to cold. So a couple of different flavors that can result that might have quality implications. 3 of them came up when we were talking about this. One is onion/garlic. that kind of vegetal aroma. The other is diacetyl. We all know diacetyl. We all love it in butter and we love it in cheese. We work with some dairy companies and they're like, diacetyl's the best. I'm like, whoa, as a brewer, we're afraid of it. And acetaldehyde is the third one. So who wants to tell us a little bit more about what acetaldehyde is, what it tastes like, what it smells like, and how it might arise in the cold side of the process?
So, acetaldehyde is it's a precursor in the production of alcohol, and it's got a very distinct kind of green apple, or sometimes people just call it a green flavor. And so, multiple ways you can kind of get this. One is just if you did not pitch enough healthy yeast. So if the yeast did not kind of get through the fermentation well, sometimes there can be a good amount of that residual acetaldehyde left behind. Other sources of this, you can actually get acetaldehyde produced by just the oxidation of ethanol, of alcohol. And so if you are getting oxygen ingress in any of your transferring, you see it sometimes in packaging. And so that's another source of where that kind of green apple-y flavor can come from. So, Erik mentioned that people are often packaging some of these very highly hopped New England style IPAs a little bit green. So sometimes that might be the case there. But that, I think, in terms of testing for this, it's in process tasting, right? I mean, tasting pre and post transfer, pre and post packaging, and just making sure you're not detecting that. If you're picking it up at certain times in that, if it's only kind of the post transfer, but it wasn't in the say your primary fermenter, then that might be indicative of getting some oxygen ingress during that transfer. Same thing with packaging. And so for that reason, I always recommend people spring for a dissolved oxygen meter that can measure in the parts per billion range. So there are, the two kind of heavyweights in that are the Antone Barr C-Box, and then there's also the Pentair Gehalte meter. So those can both be used to measure at line, kind of directly off of a tank, or in packaging. And then, there are also some that are available for actually inline that you can measure kind of mid transfer.
Now you're talking money for any of the smaller breweries on here.
Yeah, they're a pretty hefty price tag. I think the Antone Barr C-Box is probably around $30,000 now. I think the Gehalte meter is a little bit less, but this is one of those things that, I think Mel would agree with me on this, that you can set up a lab on the cheap. We both have talked about this a lot. And there's a lot of places that you can kind of cut costs and make some substitutions. But, the oxygen meter, I think, is going to be where you want to spend that money, so start saving up right now.
Yeah. And I've encountered a lot of breweries that don't have an O2 meter that can measure ppm either. And just to differentiate for anybody that's listening in, there's a huge price difference between the two. $1,200 compared to 10,000 plus. But to bounce off, John, what you were saying and kind of what Mel was saying too, specifically in relation to acetaldehyde, using your palate as an instrument, I think, is very key in developing that and standardizing your method for sensory. But it's important to know there are a lot of labs that can measure for it, but it doesn't always give you the full picture, right? There are some specific brands. We had a lager pretty recently that, we fortunately have a very, we are a third party lab as well. So we utilize our chemistry lab to give us figures that are very excessive for a 1,000-barrel-a-year brewery. And, it came back at acetaldehyde was being above threshold and fairly high, so it was concerning. And, instantly it's like you go into reaction and, you become reactive instead of proactive. And what do we do to fix this? Right? Well, the beer's already crashed. There's not much we can do. Maybe we can throw some coffee in it, which we ended up doing for one of the brands. And we ran it by panel. We had already made the decision to throw coffee in it, but I tried it once it was pointed out to me. Of course, I get a lot of acetaldehyde. The person told me that it was in there. Of course, I'm going to get it. We ran it through a panel of about a dozen people, and not one person mentioned that it was there. So I think it's important to note that the lab might give you a certain result, and that's great for benchmarking a product or process, but it doesn't always give you the full picture on how it's going to equate to perception and taste.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Mel.
Oh no, I feel like I feel like I saw your eyes light up as well, Lindsay.
Yeah, take it.
I think we both have a lot to say. So I'll keep it a little bit quick, but I want to add first I want to kind of back up and talk a little bit more about acetaldehyde and how it's perceived, because for me personally, I never perceived acetaldehyde as green apple. It just never resonated to me. So a couple of other flavor notes that you could use to identify acetaldehyde are pumpkin guts. If you've ever cracked open a butternut squash or a pumpkin, like raw inside of a squash, kind of squashy character, that resonates with me. Also, sometimes there's a latex paint, kind of a chemical component that resonates with me.
That's how I get it.
Even opening up a Sharpie, the smell of a Sharpie marker, is really interesting. And I think that I get a lot of acetaldehyde kind of character there. So you really need to develop your own relationship with these flavors, because it's not this one size fits all situation. And to that also, I'm a huge fan of in-process tasting. But there is a catch to that. In-process tasting is only as effective as the tasters are trained. So obviously people should be tasting their beer all the time, but I also would want to make sure that if I'm making some major decisions about the process of this beer and whether or not I need to dump this beer down the drain or make a dramatic addition like coffee, who's tasting the beer? Is it just one person, or do I have a small panel of individuals tasting this beer? Because everybody has holes in their palates and everybody perceives these different flavors at different thresholds. So that above threshold comment from Erik kind of resonated with me too. So the first step is investing in some sensory training or investing in some acetaldehyde standards and training your team in the brew house or whoever's pulling samples from the fermenter and tasting, to make sure that one, they can perceive acetaldehyde and have a rough idea of at what level they can perceive acetaldehyde. And then everybody has off days. So it's really important that not just one person is doing that in process tasting, but you have a small panel doing that, so you can kind of account for each other's gaps. And then I'll go on about other ways that you can maybe predict that acetaldehyde might form in your beer. But I'm sure Lindsay has a lot to say on that topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, you really nailed it. I mean, the bottom line is, as far as tasting and process and tasting in general goes, there's a right and a wrong way to do it. And it's not as easy as just tasting with, one person or two people. There are a decent amount of pitfalls around biases, and what Erik even touched on. I knew there was acetaldehyde, so of course there was acetaldehyde in there. That's a huge pitfall with just knowing a little bit too much. So it's not the most complicated thing in the world, sensory in general, but it isn't just tasting. It's more than that. It's a really intentional, and it's making sure that you're using multiple people and keeping bias low and all of that stuff. And of course, we have resources to talk about that kind of training and stuff too. As far as the acetaldehyde conversation goes, threshold is a really big thing, and the term threshold always makes me cringe a little bit, because what does that even mean? Threshold might be a number that exists, but how can we put one number when we make all sorts of different beers? Threshold in a American light lager is going to be very different than an imperial stout. And sometimes acetaldehyde doesn't even matter in an imperial stout or in a triple hopped double blah, blah, blah thing.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to expand on too.
Yeah.
And those numbers do change. And, for instance, like an American light lager diacetyl, it internally wants to be below 60 ppb, but if it's a hazy or a bigger malty beer, you can definitely almost double that to some extent and have it not stand out in the same way.
It's really a double-edged.
Well, I'm sorry. I just wanted to touch on quickly what you can do to prevent it also, or detect it, or predict it, I should say. Yeast cell counts are super important. So an under-pitched fermentation, which was mentioned as like maybe the leading cause of acetaldehyde in beer, that's preventable by pulling a sample of your pitchable, whether that's coming from the cone of another fermentation or it's coming from a fresh pitchable, and understanding what your yeast quantity is and what your yeast viability is. And that could be done in a few different ways. The basic, like telltale classic method is a microscope and a hemocytometer. It's an easy process. You can dilute your yeast sample to a readable level and use a little bit of dye to count the percentage of alive versus dead cells. This is like a little bit more of a microbiological method, so it's something that I would suggest. Well, anybody that's like gone through any sort of like brewing training within like an accredited brewing program should learn how to do a yeast cell count. There are also tools that do automated yeast cell counts now, so you don't really necessarily have to be a microbiologist to do this. And there's a ton of resources out there, including the ASBC's methods of analysis. So using that is probably, and running, you don't necessarily just need to do a yeast cell count during your pitchable. But at Avery, we did dailies where we pulled a sample from every fermenter every day, and we measured our yeast cell concentration and viability. And if we saw viability start to drop, we could oftentimes predict the formation of acetaldehyde if we saw like a rapid decrease in yeast viability.
You're speaking my love language now.
Oh, so nice. Well, in interest of time, maybe we should move on to another flavor. Even though we've talked about diacetyl a whole bunch, it might be important to go through it again. A little bit of diacetyl training never hurt. Neil, do you want to take what diacetyl is and?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the most common ways is production. It's produced largely during fermentation. Yeast produces a precursor called alpha acetolactate, and that chemically turns into diacetyl during fermentation. And then in the conditioning phase, yeast takes that diacetyl back up again. So if you have a good, healthy fermentation, you've got, if your cell count is spot on, the yeast is kind of in its comfort zone from a temperature and aeration standpoint, this will more often than not take care of itself if it's allowed to completely finish out. If you're turning cooling onto tanks early, you may be cutting that process short during maturation, or if you have unhealthy fermentations, you could be producing a whole lot of that precursor. And that precursor may not manifest itself as diacetyl in your fermenter. So you may think it's all gone. You turn cooling on and you package. Well, that precursor still turns into diacetyl chemically. So you could have diacetyl formation later on. So that's probably the most common way that it's produced.
And that's where the in-process tasting conversation, I think we could expand on that a little bit. So you cannot simply pull a sample from your fermenter, smell it and taste it, and find diacetyl at an accurate level, because it requires this chemical process, and it's usually involving oxygen and a little bit of heat. So there is a method, it's called a forced diacetyl test, where you have to actually treat the sample to force this diacetyl production to happen. So you can pull a sample, shake it up to introduce some oxygen, heat it in a hot water bath or a sous vide. It's a really low entry to to participate in this. A sous vide is like $200, and then cool the sample back down, and then you pour another sample from that same fermenter untreated, and you compare the two. And if you're trained on diacetyl and you know that you can identify diacetyl, that you don't have any gaps in your palate, hopefully it's you and a small panel of individuals tasting these 4 diacetyl samples together. You may or may not be able to identify diacetyl from that quick method.
Yep.
Additionally, there are some more chemically advanced methods. Larger breweries might have a spectrophotometer and a chemist on hand to take those measurements, but there are a ton of third-party labs that can run those kinds of tests too. But I would echo what Lindsay said earlier: beware of receiving that kind of information, and just take that information, and like what Erik said as well, take it in the larger picture with your sensory results as well. Because just an analytical result isn't necessarily going to translate to a totally defective beer.
Yeah, and results from the lab tend to not be as real time as being able to conduct the test too. And it's like, is it worth waiting an extra 24 plus hours to make a call where you might be leaving it on yeast and risking autolysis and a rise in pH and some other undesirable aspects too. So yeah, it's kind of a matrix of all of it, right? But there can be death by data too. So I would say pick what's applicable depending on the size of brewery.
One thing I wanted to touch on with diacetyl is there's been a kind of a recent uptick in an additional way that you can get diacetyl. I mean, it's the same way really, but it's at a different point. So, Neil touched on this as the precursor alpha-acetylactate is produced by yeast during normal fermentation. But especially with the really extremely hopped beers, we're seeing a phenomenon right now called hop creep much more often. And that's something that we could spend an entire hour talking about. But one of the results of that, basically the hops added in will have amylases, starch degrading enzymes that can kind of break down some dextrins and make them fermentable by the yeast. So that can lead to a kind of a second fermentation in a batch of beer that you may have thought already reached terminal gravity. And during that sort of second fermentation, the yeast will start making that precursor again. And so that's something that you want to be really careful of, especially when dry hopping at, people are putting in 3, 4, 5 pounds per barrel now. That can really get pronounced effects there. And you can get a lot of diacetyl, and it may not be apparent until, after packaging, when it's showing up this late in the fermentation.
Yep. Cool. Does anybody else have anything to add on cold side quality stuff before I move on to packaging?
Let's do it. Let's keep going.
We only get 10 minutes.
Erik loves the cold side. Yeah, we could, of course we could talk about everything. We could talk about a lot of things. So it was hard to really hone in on what to focus on for this group of people. We're just kind of skimming the surface. So nobody has anything else? Great, we'll move on. So now we're moving on into the world of packaging. We're not going to touch on finishing really. So we'll move on to packaging, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for questions if there are any, or just free discussion. So a couple of different flavors that came up is staleness or papery kind of flavor, musty, so basement musty, and then browning, so the color browning. And I kind of wanted to talk about just browning for a little while, because I don't think that we talk about it very much, but it's something that I still kind of see out in the world. So John, do you want to talk about some of the discoloration that could potentially happen, especially in lighter beers?
Yeah, absolutely. So, browning, you see this a lot in all kinds of stuff, and not just beer. When you slice an apple and leave it on the countertop, it turns brown. There's an oxidation reaction going on in there. And so when you've got a very light colored beer, pale beer, and you get some oxygen ingress, in addition to some of those flavors that Lindsay mentioned, you can get a darkening of that beer. And so this is something that, if we're talking packaging, mostly we're seeing beer going into cans nowadays. It can be very easy to get oxygen ingress in a canning line. And so, especially with mobile canners, they're moving their equipment around, they're constantly tuning things on the fly, but this can happen even in an in-house canning line. But the important bits here are making sure you've got proper kind of purging going on. That's kind of filling the can with carbon dioxide, CO2 prior to the fill. Make sure you get a nice kind of head of foam on that. Make sure that the cap or the end is fitting down onto it, kind of sliding down onto it in a diagonal manner and pushing some of that foam out. And then make sure nothing gets jostled and tipped around prior to that can hitting the seamer. So bottles, you can get oxidation as well. It's much smaller opening. I think you tend to see less oxidation in bottles. But again, it's the measurement here that's going to be important, right? I mean, you're pulling cans off of your line or bottles off of your line. You can just pop that straight into a piercer that goes in line to your oxygen meter. That's not going to give you a very clear picture if you just pull it straight off the line and pop it on. Typically, there are two different ways of getting a little bit more accurate number there. One is just shaking. So you can get these kind of orbital shakers or wrist action shakers that will actually physically shake that package and allow for any oxygen that is kind of in the headspace to get incorporated into the beer. Because when you're measuring on your oxygen meter, it's going to be flowing beer through. That's still not a complete picture, but shaking for 5 minutes is the standard. And typically you want to use an actual shaker. Everybody swears that they will shake their can vigorously for 5 minutes, but I've done that before, and your arm gets pretty tired pretty quickly. And you start talking to somebody, I got to set this down and fix something on the canning line. So, I recommend you can get these wrist action shakers, especially secondhand, for pretty inexpensive. But even shaken DO, dissolved oxygen, is not going to be a complete picture. You want your total package oxygen, TPO, and there's a calculation for this. I think there's one available through the ASBC. It involves taking a shaken DO measurement, and then also going by your volume and weight of your package, so that it takes into space the total amount of head space that you had in there, as well as in the shaken reading.
So it's not beer, but I wanted to visualize from this 10-year bottle of Sutter Home White Zin. It's probably hard to see. I'll see if I can get my light behind it. But the color is obviously pretty kind of like orangey, right? So there's been a ton of oxidation. And I often tell everybody, if you see me drinking this at work, it's either the best day I've ever had or the worst day I've ever had. I also, just for show and tell, I've got a bottle of 2000 Charles Shaw.
Whoa!
23-year bottle of $2 Chuck. So I'm pretty proud.
We have to taste that. Wow.
But to your point, it's not just beer that shows discoloration through oxidation, and white wines specifically darkening. Wine's a little more interesting because they are packaging generally with a little bit of sulfur, right, to help that preservation, and beer doesn't really have that benefit, or it's not very common. I mean, it has the benefit, but not added to package like you'd see in wine.
So yeah, I'll add to the oxygen conversation. Oxygen in packaging is your worst enemy, and making the decision to package your beer in bottles and cans, in my opinion, shouldn't be taken very lightly, because a really fabulous beer can go wrong and go bad, just by putting it through the risky process, especially if it's not very controlled of packaging. There's opportunities to introduce, when there's high levels of oxygen, there's also opportunities to introduce bacterial contamination from Acetobacter, which can lead to an acetic acid formation, which is essentially a vinegar flavor in your beer, and then all of the downstream shelf stability issues that come with total package oxygen being high. Now, I know personally that measuring total packaged oxygen is a little bit of a daunting task. For us, the wrist action shaker we had didn't fit, the little arms didn't fit our can. So we had to jimmy up this thing in order to get a can to fit in the arms and not fly across the lap and go through the window. So, but this is a really, really important step to ensure the quality of your beer. And I don't think it should be taken lightly. I'll also add that folks that are investing in mobile canning and are trusting other professionals to come into their brewery and package their beer. If this were my brewery and I were concerned, or even if I were working in a lab at this brewery, I wouldn't sign on with a mobile canner unless they had their own Gehaltometer or C box that they were bringing along to measure for CO2 and dissolved oxygen, because I think it's that important. And especially I think it was to John's point, when those machines are being taken apart and put back together, there's opportunities for oxygen ingress. So that's super important. I will add that when I was doing a little bit of research last night, I've been out of the game for a little while, so I was wondering if there are any improvements or new technologies or new instruments out there. And it does appear that Pentair has created a more approachable dissolved oxygen reader that does measure in parts per billion. It's called the Oxy2Go. And I was able to find a price on that. It's about $5,000. So I've never used it. If anybody has experience with it, please share. So I can't speak to its performance, but I trust the company. I used a Gehaltometer for years and years. And I was really excited to see that they finally kind of came up with some technology that would be a little bit more approachable to the smaller brewer. And then I can unless anybody has anything more to say on oxygen, I have a couple of comments about musty as well.
I think we're running out of time. Lindsay, did you want to wrap up?
Yeah, we literally have 1 minute. We knew that we were going to be pushing it. Reach out to Mel if you have some musty problems. We did get a question in the chat, and this is a nice wrap up, but all of us we'd love to talk about this stuff. We're available. I know that all of our contact information, I threw mine in the chat, but I don't think it went up anyway. But all of our contact information, our email addresses are on the contributor page in startabrewery.com. And my plug is to sign up for our newsletter, DraughtLab's www.draughtlab, /newsletter. So check that out. It's interesting. We send out sensory stuff all the time, just interesting tidbits and tips. And I'm sure the other contributors have other stuff to talk about too. But with interest, unless anybody wants to throw out a shout out.
Well, I want to mention that Lindsay did a craft beer professional session on sensory techniques every brewery can use. So you can find that in the YouTube archives. And then John had done a QC lab on a budget session with craft beer professionals as well. And our quick list of places to find solutions or lab testing was larger breweries, often being open to assisting smaller breweries. So in your area, you could ask your state guild to see if they can help connect you with lab assistants. You can send out a beer sample to independent labs. There are some suppliers also, like White Labs, that offer support. The Brewers Association, MBAA, and ASBC have the resources like Mel suggested with the videos that are free online. And university programs, again, like the Colorado State, potentially offer their lab resources to smaller breweries and or have suggestions or ways that they can help you as well. Anybody else want to kick in? We're 1 minute over, but anything that wants to go out there, we can do that.
Yeah, I like Mel. I'm a big fan of MBA and ASBC. ASBC offers these fishbone diagrams for root cause analysis that are pretty great. So if you have diacetyl, it kind of walks you through what your train of thought and identifying that potential problem is. And I've found a lot of benefit from those. I think there's just a lot of good resources. I mean, you could spend hours and hours on both of those and take a lot away.
It's a $210 annual membership to access these methods of analyses and the other resources with the ASBC, and I couldn't recommend it enough as a great investment for quality.
Neil, any quick thought?
I would just say that, we didn't have a chance to get into what happens after your beer leaves the brewery. But if there's one resource I could point you towards, it's the Draft Beer Quality Manual. It's a publication of the Brewers Association. You can find it at the Brewers Association website. You don't even have to be a member to access that. It's a free download. Includes basically every consideration we could think of to include for taking care of draft beer, which is where a good portion of the things pop up with beer after it leaves the brewery. Draft beer is kind of one of those major pitfalls. So it's everything from system design, gas dispense, line cleaning, storage, and serving. So that'd be my recommended resource.
Cool. John, any quick notes?
I just actually want to plug your resource, Laura. Startabrewery.com is a great website, but I think one of the things that Laura and Candace have done is they've created a community, and they have a resource group with regular meetings, and so those are great opportunities to come in. There's usually a presentation, but I know when I was struggling to find some instructors for our program last year, I went into one of those resource groups, and I got 5 or 6 people that were interested right off the bat. But there's always people within that group that are going to be interested in helping you out with, there's usually some quality QA/QC focused people. There's often kind of beer adjacent as well. In other words, the business of brewing and legal advice and things like that. So it's a great resource.
Thank you for that, John. And I think Mel and a couple other QA/QC people, Erik too, have written about establishing a basic lab, which was one of the comments of people starting basic labs. So there's some articles in the library about that, in addition to reaching out to these folks directly. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again to Andrew, to all the sponsors. Thank you, Lindsay, John, Erik, Mel, Neil. Thank you for being here today. And we'd love to do this again. Maybe we could do a part 2 sometime.
Love to.
Let's party.
We got to open it.
Woo!
No doubt. All right. See you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
See ya.
Bye.